All right. Okay, so welcome to the archive, David. How are you today?
I'm doing well.
Good,
It's a nice day.
good. So what is your position here at the House 7 Gables?
I'm a researcher. My title is Visitor Services Specialist. But I do a lot of our research and interpretation.
Okay. When did you start working here?
2012. So I've been here almost 11 years.
Nice. All right. And what got you started here with the House 7 Gables?
Yeah, I had grown up around here. Grew up in Hamilton, so not far from Salem. Came here a good amount when I was growing up. I came to the House of the Seven Gables when I was 8. And then I was living in Salem and moved here in 2008. And I graduated college 2012, looking for a good job, and ended up here. Found I was interested in I'd studied English and a little bit of history, so it was a nice mix of them. Interested in Nathaniel Hawthorne's writing, and so I got a job here. It's worked out pretty well.
Yeah. So as an English major, I just got to ask quickly, what is, since you work here with Nathaniel Hawthorne's house, what is your favorite work of his?
That's a good question. The Marble Faun, which is his last novel, is probably my favorite. It's one of his stranger books. It's his longest novel, but it's set in Rome, and it's got a lot of story, sort of background about sin and things like that. But one of the main tensions of it is between art and real life, and art as representation and how that interplays, and all. And I find that really fascinating.
All right. And so before we get into the House 7 Gables with Nathaniel Hawthorne's house, what do you feel is Nathaniel Hawthorne's legacy with America as an author?
Yeah, Hawthorne is really one of the first great American authors. And there were plenty of people who wrote in America before he did. There are plenty of people who wrote some great works. But he's one of the first writers that's uniquely American in his outlook and his writing. He is one of the first sort of modern writers in America that's respected overseas. And so Hawthorne is one of those people who really puts American literature on the map. He's one of the people, like his early works, like his short stories, and then especially with the Scarlet Letter and the House of the Seven Gables, which come out in 1850 and 1851. He's one of those people, he's part of this generation of American writers with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Walt Whitman to a sort of a different way, Herman Melville, that some of those people weren't really appreciated until the 20th century, but and like a little bit younger than him, Emily Dickinson and Louisa May Alcott, but and his generation, like Henry David Thoreau and Emerson. Like there's these writers who are really creating the early American canon, and he's a big part of that.
Yeah. And the Scarlet Letters, that's his most famous work. That's the one that like pretty much everybody would go to high school and learn about at some point. Distinctively, what do you think? And it doesn't even just have to be the Scarlet Letter. What about him makes him stand out from the rest of this time period?
Yeah. The Scarlet Letter fits into a tradition of writing at that time in America that's starting to like look back at American history a little bit. It fits in with the Gothic tradition in Europe, especially the way that it sets up that the opening of the book, he talks about finding the real Scarlet Letter and how it's this story from history that's never been told, and sort of playing a little bit about with that, fact versus fiction. But it's very unique in its message and its story. There weren't a lot of people in America in the 1840s or 50s writing stories about women in Puritan Boston, going against the patriarchal society that they lived in and using it as this great metaphor for the individual and the society and art and all of these different things. And so it was a pretty, I think one of the reasons people look at it still as a masterpiece is that not only is it supremely well written, but it was just very daring in its subject matter, and at a time that there wasn't really anything quite like it.
Yeah. So there wasn't really any like female heroes like that at the time?
So there were a lot of the books, the most popular books in America from the late 1700s into the mid 1800s were written by women. People like Susanna Rosen, and a lot of the books had female heroines, but followed some of them are sort of formulaic in their production. A lot of them are these novels of seduction, they're often called, where a woman will be seduced by a man with bad intentions who ruin her virtue. And so the Coquette is the famous example of that novel that came out around the time of the American Revolution. And so there were definitely female writers and female main characters, not as many in books written by men. And so there's a lot of debate still, is Hawthorne a feminist writer? Is he a patriarchal writer? But there's, I believe that he's one of the only male writers at that time who's writing a female character like Hester Prynne with like real deep characterization and something to say about the patriarchy and the state of society.
Yeah. So what was it like for you to just go out to Hawthorne's place for the first time after having studied him?
Yeah, it's really cool. It's, one of my favorite things about working here is that I get to spend a lot of time by myself in these houses and spaces, and you feel a real connection with them. So you feel almost a little bit of ownership and a sense of belonging, which is, a little bit of a connection through time with Hawthorne or some of the other people who've lived here. But the very first time, and so when I first visited the house, I hadn't really read any Hawthorne. I was just a kid. But coming back to it, I hadn't read The House of the Seven Gables before I started working here. I'd read The Scarlet Letter and some of Hawthorne's short stories and things like that, but I'd never read the book that was inspired by the house. And then getting to read that book as I was first getting to really know this place made it a really interesting experience.
Yeah. So, how did the Hawthorne's house come to be?
Yeah. So there's a couple of houses on our site here. The main house is the House of the Seven Gables, which is also sometimes called the Turner Ingersoll Mansion, because it was built by the Turner family and then later on lived in by the Ingersoll family. And that was a ship captain's house built in the 1660s. And by the time that Nathaniel Hawthorne was growing up in Salem, his cousin owned it. And so Hawthorne was good friends with his cousin Susanna Ingersoll. She owned the house outright since 1811. And so as a young man, Hawthorne would come and visit her, and then we know in later life he was also paying visits. And in 1840, there's a letter that he supposedly wrote. It doesn't survive today, but accounts of it from the 19th century do, where he said that Susanna brought him up to the attic, showed him some of the gables and the old house. He was somebody who was interested in early architecture. He was interested in the history of Salem. And so that story that this house once had all these gables and had this sort of maze-like, sort of Gothic look to it, captured his imagination. He said in that letter, I should make something of it, the House of the Seven Gables. And that really was the genesis a few years later for a novel called The House of the Seven Gables that he wrote. So it's this Gothic novel, a romance as he calls it, about a family haunted by a curse from the time of the witch trials. And the inspiration for it and the setting changed around a little bit is this house that his cousin lived in. And so in the years after that, the late 1800s, people start to visit the house. And they say, oh, wow, this is Hawthorne's House of the Seven Gables. And he becomes internationally famous in the 1850s. And so people start to come to Salem to see things associated with Hawthorne. And so by the 1880s and 90s, there are tourists coming to see this house. And so a woman from Salem named Caroline Emerton, who's a philanthropist, She buys it. She's setting up a charity to help immigrant families called the Settlement House. And she decides the best fundraising she could do is buying the House of the Seven Gables, making that into a museum. And so this is really ambitious project that she undertakes, opens the house as a museum in 1910. And so for over a century now, people have been visiting the House of the Seven Gables. And then in 1958, after Caroline Emerson passed away, his birth house was available for purchase. And so the museum bought it to save it from destruction and moved it to the site. And so for a little over 100 years, we've been one of the main historical sites associated with Nathaniel Hawthorne, and we also mix in, some of the architecture, the maritime history, and then like philanthropy, the history of social work and that movement in the United States.
Yeah. Now, is there anything specific to Hawthorne's house that you feel like gets overlooked or something that should be covered or mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, the history of the house is fascinating. We give people a 45-minute tour, but you could really delve into side pieces and notes, and there's still things I'm uncovering about this house that we hadn't known previously, or that.
Is there anything particular you want to share?
Yeah. Let me think. I mean, one of the coolest things to me is we did a lot of work in the late 2010s, like about 2017, 2018, restoring the second floor of the house. And as we pulled up the floorboards, we saw the 1600s plaster treatment, which had never been exposed before, really. We saw within the wall, found fragments of German pottery that had been used just as filling in the mortar. Found a diamond that someone had lost from a ring at some point taking a tour of the house. And then we found out that the structure of the beams that the support posts were actually a lot longer than we had thought on that side of the house. Along that same project, finding out that the way the stairs in the house had originally been oriented were totally different from how they came to be today. So just these little pieces of the history that you uncover piece by piece. I mean, one of the most recent is, for many years, there's a lot of mystery over a woman named Mary Stuart Clough, who lived with Susanna in the house. So she was in the House of the Seven Gables when Hawthorne visited. She was an older woman, and then when Susanna was writing her will, probably about 20 years before she really passed away, she said, okay, well, the house is to go to my adopted son if he looks over Mary Clough. And there was a lot of, who is this woman? And then just last year, going through probates of some of the Ingersoll's relatives, I found a mention of a Gibson Clough, who turned out to be Mary's father. And so she turned out to be a cousin of Susanna Ingersoll. And so it was common at that time for poorer relations to come and live in your house, and often they would do sort of domestic work like a servant, but you'd pay for their room and board, their food, and they could live in your house. And so it solved this mystery of who is this woman who's living in the House of the Seven Gables, and so why is she there? Yeah, but just little stuff like that.
Very unique. Yeah, so there's all these little, stories and histories that tie to all these different little characters too that you guys to this day are still uncovering.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really unique. So, so getting on a little bit to the House of the Seven Gables itself. So,
yeah,
how did it get it? So, how did it get its name? Because from my understanding, is it originally didn't have seven gables to it.
Yeah, the number of gables has changed a lot over the years, and the name, the House of the Seven Gables, comes from Hawthorne's novel. That's really where it takes on that identity and that name. But when it was first built, it's built by a merchant family, the Turners. John Turner is a rich merchant, 1668. The house probably had 4 gables, 2 on the front side, and then the 2 on the edges, the sides of the house. And that's pretty typical. The wealthy merchant houses that we see surviving from that time typically have 3 or 4 gables. But then the Turners make so much money that they keep adding on additions and expanding the house, so that we think by 1677, when they build this massive south wing onto the house, which is unprecedented in any other house that survives from the time, because they were that rich, that the house had 7. And so that set it apart as this mansion with 7 gables. In the early 1800s, or the late 1700s, the last owner of the house removed 4 of the gables as he was doing restoration work, and it got down to just 3 gables. And so when Susanna Ingersoll was living there and Nathaniel Hawthorne was visiting, it was the house of 3 gables, basically. Everybody would just called it the old Turner house or the Turner house, but when Hawthorne goes up to the attic and hears about those older gables and Susanna shows him where they'd been, that idea of this massive merchant's mansion, in the opening line of the novel, he says they're acutely peaked gables pointing in different directions of the compass. That captures his imagination. And he uses that as the setting for the book. The fact that it has 7 gables has this sort of almost mythical quality, sort of like numerological, like the 7 that you see in a lot of folklore and stuff. But then, because it's so famous in the novel as the House of the 7 Gables, they add those other gables back when they restore the house in the early 1900s. So when Caroline Emerton turns it into a museum, she rebuilds a back wing and adds some gables onto the roof to make it look as it would have in the 1600s and 1700s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you also mentioned that 7 was like a big folklore number at the time. So did the time period have its own numerology? Were people really into numerology at that time?
Yeah, I don't know to what extent Hawthorne was, but you do see a lot of numerology in different types of religious texts and things like that that existed in America in the 1800s. Hawthorne himself was a pretty skeptical guy, and so I don't know to what degree he lent into any of that. But I have heard a lot of people making that connection that 7, is this very significant number in a lot of folklore, and so that might be why he sort of gravitated towards that idea of a house of the 7 gables. I mean, it could have just been that he liked the way it sounded. Or it could be that he saw some connection with, all the other, like stories that feature groups of 7 and things like that.
Yeah. So, are there, there definitely are, like, some parts of the house where there's, like, some kind of secret hidden stairs. And,
yeah.
Were those things that were intentionally made by the original owners, or were those things made later on for, through the museum?
Yeah. So the famous secret staircase that's at the center of the house was added, what we have now was added for the museum. We know what is in the chimney today. It's a staircase of 20 wooden steps that wind around and go from the dining room up to the attic. Those were added by Caroline Emerton, her architect. The blueprints show them as new construction. There's no way you could have a staircase inside a chimney like that and not have it get too hot or have the smoke, with flues for the smoke to escape. But there is a mystery, and it's an enduring mystery, that the last owner of the house, Henry Upton, so he's the guy who owns it between the Ingersolls and Caroline Emerton, he's doing work on the house in by 1890, and takes down the original chimney to replace it and says that he uncovers a secret staircase. Now, he takes that down. So any physical evidence of it was gone by the time the house was restored, but he tells this story to Caroline Emerton, and she's like, this is a great, maybe Hawthorne knew about this secret passageway and stuff like that. So that's why she rebuilds the secret staircase. Our best guess today is that it was probably just an older staircase. The house went through a lot of changes over the years, and so it's quite possible that it had been a staircase in the house in the 1600s that got boarded up as they changed around the back of it in the 1790s and took off some of those gables. It would not have been inside the chimney, but probably ran up alongside it. But there was some kind of a passage that was closed up in the walls. So probably never built to be secret, but just ended up hidden over the years as the house changed around it.
Very unique.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find it very funny. Like you can, done the tour a couple of times, but it's funny the whole notion of this hidden staircase with a fireplace. All these, that silly idea of like servants running up and down through the staircase all day, and there's this fireplace going to keep the house warm, and how hot it could have been there.
Yeah, it doesn't seem very practical to have it in the chimney itself.
Yeah. So are there other unique things of either the time or when the place was made in a museum, such as this staircase that might not get as much attention?
Yeah. So there was a recreation. I mean, it's part of the tour, but they recreated a scent shop, like a little store in the house from Hawthorne's novel. And so they did that originally in 1910 and then expanded it in the 1920s to look like a little sort of general dry goods store from the 1800s. They reproduced a lot of paneling. They found the original batten door. So the original front door with all these iron nails in it had been reused and used as salvage board outside the house. And so they found that and recreated the front door based on that. They found, and that's one of only just maybe two that I've heard of, I think maybe three of those kind of batten doors that have survived from the 1600s. As they were doing all sorts of work on the house, they uncovered all sorts of, the people who were working on it. Joseph Chandler was an architect who oversaw it, and he did a lot of work with colonial houses. And so in the process, he was learning a lot about colonial construction. There are only so many of these houses from the 1600s that survive, and they were built so idiosyncratically and so different from each other that there's something to be learned from each of them. Like each is its own really important document. Mm-hmm. And so that really was a unique experience and an opportunity for them.
So houses during the colonial era, were colonial houses not built the same?
Yeah, I mean, they were built for the specifications of the person who was asking for them and the knowledge of the builder. In the 1600s and early 1700s, they didn't have trained architects in America. People didn't go to college and learn how to build a building. You just learned on the job. You would go and work on a house, and you'd apprentice and learn, this is how you fit beams together, and this is how the overhang has to be shaped, and this is where the doors have to go. But so the builders, and they had their own regional traditions from England. Like if you came from somewhere in the West Country like Cornwall, you'd build houses differently than someone who came from East Anglia like Essex or Norfolk, and that impacts it too.
Okay. And so these were only the houses that could actually be built like houses as we perceive today. Other than that, it would kind of be like the village you guys have at the other end of Salem, where people would essentially just kind of build a box with a roof and a chimney.
Yeah. So most people's houses were very rudimentary. Most people's houses would be 1 or 2 rooms with a dirt floor, maybe a second story with some storage space, and maybe in some cases like a half-dug crawl space, like cellar underneath. But a lot of times it's just very simple structure. And then the ones that survive were wealthier people's houses, which tended to be small by modern standards, but they were built with better quality materials. They were built more to last. They often had wooden floors, and they were larger, so they were able to survive. As styles changed, people in the 1800s didn't want to live in a cramped, even by the late 1700s, no one wanted to live in a cramped one-room dirt floor cottage. They, people were generally wealthy enough that they could live in a more comfortable multi-room house. Yeah. Even a lot of the poorer people in the 1700s had more commodious and spacious accommodations than people had in the 1600s.
Okay. And so, is there something that stands out about this house? Because you mentioned like some pottery from Germany before.
Yeah.
So is this like eclectic from across Europe in the way that this house has been built?
Not in its building, but in the stuff inside of it. And so, like, German pottery was the most common pottery that people had in the colonies because of the methods of like salt glazing and things like that they developed in the Rhineland. And then there was a good amount of local pottery and English pottery. You see examples in some places in New England of pottery traveling all the way from Spain or Portugal or Italy. The Turners, we know by the mid-1700s, have a lot of Chinese porcelain, both what they call burnt china that's got like red and orange colors to it, and then blue and white china as we think of it kind of stereotypically today. And then they've got mezzotints that might have come from Europe. They've got different textiles that came from as far away as India, like muslin and camlet from the Netherlands. So there's like an international presence because the Turners are merchants, and so they're traveling to Barbados, specifically to Virginia and to England, probably also trading in northern Spain. And then those destinations are themselves linked to these vast trade networks that connected to places around the world. So if you're going to, northern Spain or England, you're going to have connections with the empires that those places have, with the trade routes around the continent. And so a wide variety of goods are coming into Salem even before the Revolution, when the merchants from Salem can themselves start going to other continents and other places.
That's very unique.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a global global history within this house.
Yeah. That's like one of the things I try and get across the most, is that the world has always been global. That we think of globalism and the connecting of countries and cultures as something that's really only developed in the last 200, or some people even think the last like 50 years. But you look back, even the antiquity or the Middle Ages, there's so much connection between cultures, between people, and by the early modern period, you're in many ways not too removed from society today, and you have so much trade and cultural connection between all the corners of the globe. And a place like Salem is a hub within these vast global trade networks that are, especially by the 1780s and 90s, like they're going everywhere.
Yeah. So there are other houses as well on the property.
Yeah.
Now, were these houses original, or was it post-museum?
They were post-museum. So the house that we're in right now is the Hooper Hathaway house. And in 1911, this house was in danger of being torn down to build a movie theater. And they tore it. They were going to tear it down. So the museum bought it and had it brought by train car basically across the city. And this is one of the first houses that was saved for its architectural significance. It was not a house that had any connection to Hawthorne or anything like that. It didn't have any connection to the Revolution. It's not like, George Washington stayed there. It was a house built by a family of shoemakers. But that idea, as I was saying earlier, that each house from the 1600s is its own unique thing. The antiquarians and the historians in the early 1900s said, we can't let this house get destroyed. And it ended up having, at the time they thought of this house as much more interesting than the House of the Seven Gables in terms of its architecture, because some of the beams may be salvaged from the home that Governor John Endicott had built in the 1620s. So they may be some of the earliest European carved beams in the United States. They found some window patterns and things for early American houses that they hadn't found anywhere else yet, that proved very important as they started thinking about how early American houses had windows and things like that. And it's been a really interesting house since it moved to the property. At times it's been setting for social work classes, it's been a bed and breakfast, it's been staff offices, which is mostly what it is today, but also like a function rental space. And it's had some period rooms over the years. So it was brought here in 1911, and it's, over a century now. It's gone through a couple different uses here.
Very neat.
Yeah.
So what about the other houses on the property?
Yeah, there's the retired Beckett house, which is our gift shop nowadays. And it was moved to the property in 1924. So about 10 years after the Hooper Hathaway house, Caroline Emerton wanted to use it as an antique store. She's saying, she collected quite a lot of antiques. She was showing them off in the house, and she knew that there was a market there. You go through the House of the Seven Gables and see some Staffordshire dogs, like these porcelain or these ceramic dogs from the 1800s, and you say, those would look really good in my house. Like, I wish I had some of those. Oh, look, there's a shop right here, and I can buy some. Or like a bed warmer, that's charming and reminds me of what life might have been like. And then, oh wow, you can go and buy a bed warmer right here. So she used that as an antique store, and it lasted that way at least up into the 60s, before it transitioned to being more of like a traditional museum gift shop with souvenirs and things like that. Previously, the souvenirs had been sold in the House of the Seven Gables in a little cent shop. But the house itself, for many years, and when Caroline Emerton acquired it, they thought it was from the 1650s, that it was the oldest house still standing in Salem. We dated the wood scientifically about 2 years ago and discovered, as the reports come back, that it's built in 1686, most likely. So it's still a house from the 1600s, still an incredibly important building, not quite as old as we thought it was, but still built by the Beckett family. It gets its name, Retire Beckett, not from the first builder, but from the most famous person who lived there, who was a shipbuilder in the 1800s, who built America's first luxury yacht, Cleopatra's Barge, which they have a reconstruction of in the Peabody Essex Museum here in Salem. And the Beckett family for multiple generations lived in that house building ships. And it's a good example. The oldest part of the house is really just one room over one. And it's a good example of how a wealthy family, but not quite as wealthy as the Turners, would have built a house at that time.
Okay. And are we missing any other houses, or do we have all that?
Well, there's the Hawthorne birthplace.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a 1750 or so blacksmith's house.
Okay.
It's Georgian in style, so it's almost a century newer than these other houses. And so that's got its own features, but it's got its original chimney and hearths, a lot of the paneling from the 1700s. It's a unique structure, and that was brought here in the 50s. And we've got our little counting house, which we call it a counting house, like a little business office. We don't really know much of the history of it. It was called that by Caroline Emerton. We know by the late 1800s it was being used as a garden shed by Henry Upton. But that's always been on the site. So that was moved around the site, but that house and the House of the Seven Gables are the ones that have always been here.
Okay. And so, now there's, obviously, like, there's people come and go, there's going to be words said about the place. Are there any, untrue myths or rumors about this place that ever circulate?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most common is people thinking that the secret staircase is real, and it's sort of ambiguous because there's that, earlier secret passageway, and that's something that we spread as a site, from early on in the 1910s. Caroline Emerton was very clear, like, oh no, this is a reconstruction of what was here, or what I heard was here. But already by the 1920s, and then especially after she dies in 1942, the story becomes, oh no, this is the secret passageway that was built by John Turner II in 1692 to hide his sisters from the witchcraft trials. Or, oh no, this is the secret passageway that was built to hide loyalist soldiers during the Revolution. And then in the 1980s, the idea became, oh, this is the secret passageway that was used to hide fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad. And so that became, if you visited the house from like 1987 to about 2004, that was the story you would hear, was about the Underground Railroad. And there's no evidence really to connect the house to the Underground Railroad. The secret passageway, as I was saying, was added, the one we have now, in 1910, so that's really not possible. And so that's a big one. And then another myth that's sort of come up more recently, it's a little more niche, but the idea that the house was built by Samuel Wardwell, who was one of the people executed during the Salem witch trials. We know he was a carpenter, and there's a tradition that arose from a single book that was written in the early 90s saying that Wardwell is the person who built the house. There's no evidence of that. We don't know who the builders were who built the house. It's remained anonymous. And so a lot of Wardwell descendants, that has spread pretty far and wide that he built the house. But there's no evidence that we've ever seen to connect that.
Okay. Is there any connection these buildings have with the witch trials?
Yeah.
So are there any connections that any of these houses or buildings have with the witch trials?
The only direct connection that these houses have with the witch trials is that John Turner II, who lived in the House of the Seven Gables in the time of the witch trials with his sisters, he was about 21 years old. And someone in court brought up a story that he'd been pushed out of a tree by the specter of Anne Puttitter. And so she was on trial for witchcraft. She was an elderly woman in Salem, and that was one of a laundry list of accusations that people brought up against her. I think it was Mercy Warren, one of the afflicted girls, said that, I heard that John Turner was pushed out of a tree by Anne Puttitter. It seems like something that happened about a decade before the trials, if I remember right. My guess has always been that, John Turner, his father, had probably just recently passed away. He's this kid growing up in the richest family in town. Maybe he's climbing one of her trees in her orchard, and she comes out and she's like, "Hey, what are you doing up there?" And he's like, "Do you know who my father is? He lives over in the Turner house." And then she's like, "Get out of that tree." And then he falls and hurts himself and says, "Oh, you did that to me." So he's not in court himself telling this story. Somebody else is. But his name is on the list of accusations, and then later Anne Puttitter was hanged for witchcraft, and one of the charges was pushing John Turner out of a tree. And so he doesn't show up in any of the other court records. He's not there giving testimony. He's not being called upon in any other person's testimony saying, I had just come from John Turner's house and then I saw such and such. He's just absent from the records, which is strange because he was one of the most prominent. He was young, but that's maybe one of the reasons he doesn't really get involved too much. Mm-hmm. But Philip English, whose wife was accused in the trials, was the richest man in Salem at the time of it. He was a business partner of John Turner II's father, so there's some connections there. And then there's a criticism of the witch trials that's published, and there's a court case about it. A man named Thomas Mall writes a book saying the witch trials were a travesty and all these things. And John Turner was the foreman of the jury that acquitted him. And so some historians like Emerson Baker have looked at that as one of the first victories of freedom of speech or freedom of the press in what would later become the United States. And it's a decidedly anti-Salem witch trials verdict that happened in 1696, so just 4 years after the trials. And John Turner II was directly involved in that. But beyond that, there's not really much connection.
Okay. So, were there any other big points in history, any houses or parts of these grounds that have connection with, you mentioned refugee, the midst of hiding slaves?
Yeah.
Was it connected with abolition in the Civil War? Was it connected with the Revolutionary War?
Yeah. So there's a lot of the colonial wars. So from 1675 with the Metacom's War, or sometimes called King Philip's War, to a few others like King William's War, Queen Anne's War, these conflicts between the French and the English with their indigenous allies. And several people, if you look at the site as a whole, like the Hooper Hathaway house, Benjamin Hooper, who built it, fought in Metacom's War. you had the Hawthorne ancestors involved in various wars, like King Philip's War. And then John Turner II, when he got a little older, he was a colonel who fought in Queen Anne's War in the early 1700s. And so there's a definite connection with those wars. Fast forward to the Revolution, almost all of these houses have connections with privateers who are going out and pirating British ships as part of the war efforts. It was a big part of Salem's history.
And is there also like a bay right behind here?
Yeah, so we're right on Salem Harbor, which opens out to the ocean. But the reason that the English settled here is because it's this nice sheltered harbor. And then, by the time of the War of 1812, it's Susanna Ingersoll lives in the house. And they're really the only, from the time post-colonies, like the only real like fighting and battles that you see around here are some of the naval engagements during the War of 1812. And there's a ball that Susanna gives at the House of the Seven Gables during the war. And then by the time you get to the Civil War, there's a descendant of one of the families who lives here, Henry Rust. He moves up and he actually founds the town of Norway, Maine. And I think it's his grandson becomes a general in the Union Army during the Civil War. But by that point, Susanna Ingersoll passed away in 1858. Her adopted son Horace was an old man by the time of the war. Hawthorne, writes a lot about the Civil War. It has a big effect on his political outlook near the end of his life. But there's no other real connection between like the House of the Seven Gables and the Civil War, except for the history of American slavery. Because the Turners, in their business trading with the Caribbean, were engaged in this wider Atlantic trade that's all about the trafficking of Africans. And so they're supplying codfish to these massive sugar plantations in Barbados. John Turner's cousin has a sugar plantation. And in the early 1700s, we have records that in the 1730s and 40s, there were 4 people enslaved by the Turners. And then in the 1750s and 60s, there's a 5th. And so we know about these 2 men, Titus and Lewis, who were probably African in ethnicity, born maybe in New England, maybe in the Caribbean, maybe in Africa, we're not quite sure. And then Rebecca, Phyllis, and Jane, these 3 women, and they were enslaved by the Turner family. And so some people are surprised to hear about slavery in New England, but it was a big part of the economy, those trade networks. New England really made most of its wealth initially as the provisioners of these plantations in the Caribbean. And you look at a colony like Rhode Island, and they're the second most dense in terms of their population of enslaved people in the 1700s, that it's a big part of New England history that was intentionally forgotten in the mid-1800s. Like in that lead up to the Civil War, a lot of New Englanders said, okay, yeah, no, that's a Southern problem. That wasn't us. We haven't had enslaved people and stuff like that. So conversely, there's no real connection of the house to the Underground Railroad as far as we know, but there's a very concrete connection to the history of slavery.
Is there anything with these with the houses or the grounds you would like to cover?
Yeah, the big thing that strikes me about the Gables is just how much history and how many stories there are with these different places. The Upton family, who I just briefly touched on, this family that they're the ones here from 1883 until 1908. So for 25 years, they owned the House of the Seven Gables. Salem, at that point, was more of an industrial city. There's a lot of manufacturing here. This neighborhood starts to become, by the late 1800s, like a more heavily immigrant neighborhood with a lot of Polish people living in the area right around the House of the Seven Gables on the harbor. The property of the Gables had been cut back over the years by land sales to be just a fraction of what it is again today, which is more similar to what the Turners had in the 1600s and early 1700s. And so the Uptons are this middle-class family who live in this big mansion that by that time has become sort of more of an average house. You know, a really wealthy family in Salem, they're probably going to live in a custom-built house, a big Italianate mansion or something like that with multiple rooms. The Uptons, he starts out as a gas fitter and a plumber, and then he's made enough money as a musician by originally by just like hobby and then by vocation. And so he moves into the house of the Seven Gables. His wife buys it in 1883. She's the one who's on the deed. And her father had been a laborer. So, I mean, they're sort of rising in status. But they move into what's the only like middle class enclave in this very working class neighborhood by that point. It had gone from being the center of some of the wealthiest people in the colonies to being this working class harbor. And they're a very Victorian family, very artistic. You know, they love music and dance. Their daughter Henrietta goes to Emerson College and studies oration and then takes over her father's dancing school. And their son Henry Jr. is a pianist. Their daughter Ida invents the Salem witch as we know it today. So she's an illustrator and she's a ceramicist who makes these beautiful ceramic dishes and teacups and things like that. And to decorate them right around the time of the 300th anniversary of the witch trials, or the 200th anniversary, so 1892, she designs this image of a Salem witch riding a broomstick in front of the moon that's since become iconic. And so that's designed as these ceramics they're selling in the House of the Seven Gables. And they start to offer tours for a quarter to people who walk down the street and say, oh, can we see Hawthorne's House of the Seven Gables? And so they are this really interesting family who really build the house's reputation in the novel. And Henry Upton publishes sheet music that's based on the novel and says, you know, this is Hawthorne's House of the Seven Gables.
Do you guys have any of original or of-the-time artifacts?
Yeah, so we have the most rare one we have is a glass teacup that has the Salem witch on it. And then we have...
is that on display anywhere?
Not at the moment. It's sort of come in and off of display because it's very delicate and it's sensitive to the light. So right now it's not on display, but I think the plan is down the line as we work towards creating some more like designated exhibit space to really give that the proper display that it would need. Yeah. But we have some other pieces by, her name is Ida Upton Payne. She married a man named Frank Payne, so that was her married name. And you can also find pieces by her, like, sometimes they come up on, like, eBay and stuff like that. Like, she operated a store in Salem for decades and sold pieces like this. So there's a good number of them floating around. And we have some of the sheet music that Henry Upton published with the House of the Seven Gables, like the House of the Seven Gables caper and stuff like that. These, piano music scores that you could dance to, and the caper even has a set dance that he suggests for how to dance with it.
All right, and you guys have some of that as well?
Yeah, so we have that. We have that sheet music. We have the Upton cups. Now, when it comes to earlier generations, the Turners and the Ingersolls, there are specific instances where the whole collection in the house, all the furniture and all that, was sold. And so most of that furniture has been dispersed. But there are a few key pieces here and there. Like we have some vases and a tray that are said to have belonged to Susanna Ingersoll. We have 2 portraits of Susanna. We have a lot of artifacts dug up during an archaeological dig related to the Turners. Fragments of pottery, like that Westerwald pottery piece I was mentioning, but also like bottle stamps that had John Turner's name on them, a piece of a weight for a scale, a piece of a window lead, like the divider for one of the windows from 1668,
Do you have anything for the dances?
For the dances, just his business cards. Like, so the description of the dance survives. He sold these charts for like waltzing and things like that, like a home waltz chart where you could follow the footsteps and learn how to waltz. But we don't have one of those. I don't know if any of those have survived. And then with Hawthorne, we've acquired a lot through descendants. So we have a lot of furniture that's directly connected with Hawthorne or his family. Some Hawthorne manuscripts and letters, things like that.
And it's on display or recreations on display?
Yeah, it's a mix. So a lot of the Hawthorne stuff is on display throughout the House of the Seven Gables and the Hawthorne birthplace. A lot of the Turner stuff is, but some of it's just like a question of displaying or storage and stuff like that. But a good mix of the original stuff's on display.
Is there anything you have to recommend about checking out the House of Seven Gables?
Yeah, and so we're interesting in that regard because Hawthorne's novel is a ghost story. The House of the Seven Gables, as Hawthorne wrote it, is a haunted house, haunted by the witch trials. And so it's got that kind of gothic, forbidding feel to it. It's painted black by the restorationists in the early 1900s to give it that aged wood look.
And it kind of looks like a Vincent Price movie setting in here.
Yeah, and Vincent Price was in two different versions of the House of the Seven Gables.
And was one actually filmed here?
Probably no. I don't think either of them were filmed here. The house that the 1940 film was filmed at is part of like a studio lot in LA that's now become a neighborhood, and so it looks like a regular sort of colonial house, but somebody tracked down that that's the house that they built for the 1940 Universal Pictures House of the Seven Gables.
Oh, cool.
I don't know about the 63 one. It's like a vignette within Twice Told Tales, and one of them is the House of the Seven Gables. But he later came and he filmed, he recorded a narration for a tour of the house in the 80s, I think it was, that you can actually watch on YouTube. So he was a big fan of the House of the Seven Gables. So it's got that connection. So there's the macabre, the creepy, gothic element of the book. You know, in real life, there's no connection with the house, with the trials beyond what I was mentioning, like those sort of glancing connections. In terms of, you know, hauntings and ghosts, our official position as a museum is that we're not a haunted house. And I mean, I've spent a good amount of my life walking around these houses at night, turning off lights, the only person on the property, or, you know, there's just a couple people and I'm the only person up in the attic of the Gables, and, you know, I haven't experienced anything like that. But
it sure will freak you out.
Yeah, it can definitely be, you know, it's a weird feeling.
Yeah, to be in a house like this,
yeah,
immediately thinking about horror movies.
Yeah. Turning off all the lights and just walking around in the dark, it can definitely be a little suggestive.
So is there anything you recommend for people to check out who are going to come here?
Yeah, so the Salem Witch Museum has been doing a lot of work in the last decade or so researching the Salem witch trials and putting together information about the individuals involved. So that's a good place to go to learn about the trials. The witch house that's run by the city of Salem was the home of Judge Corwin, who was one of the judges during the Salem witch trials. And so that's got a direct connection with the trials. And another sort of unique 1600s house, the cemetery, that's just recently had a visitor center opened in the 1670s Pickman House. There's some slight connections with the witch trials with that house, but many of the people involved with the trials, like Judge Hawthorne, are buried and their gravestones are still there. There's accused people, afflicted people, and one of the judges with gravestones and other people involved in the trials, like at that cemetery. Yeah. And then right next to it is the memorial to the victims of the Salem witch trials, the 20 people who were killed as part of that.
Yeah. Is there anywhere, are you guys going to be doing anything here special this year, this October?
Well, so we have had performances and things in the past in October about The House of the Seven Gables as a novel, Hawthorne's connection with the witch trials. We retired those around the time of COVID. It wasn't because of COVID, but that was sort of, we were already ending them, and then that just accelerated that. But we're looking at new programming alternatives and things like that. I don't know exactly what our October programming is going to be, but we get a lot of people in October.
Yeah.
We get about a third of our visitors.
And people can always find it on your guys' website.
Yeah, so if you go to 7gables.org, which is the number 7, and then Gables, GABLES.org, you'll find all sorts of information. If you become a member, you get a newsletter that has all the updates about what's going on in site, and like free or discounted tickets to events and stuff we're doing. But there's always something going on. Between being an active settlement house that still does ESL and like citizenship classes, and just recently we had like a salsa dance party and Polish and like Ukrainian art and cooking classes and things like that. And then we've got like lectures about history and literature. We have all sorts of special tours. We have garden parties, tea parties. Like, there's a lot going on here. So if you check out the website, you can see what's going on currently.
Cool. And what do you think is the legacy here?
Yeah, it's a few different legacies. There's the wealth, like the maritime wealth, and that history of early America, and how the English arrived here and made a new England, created this replica in some ways of their homes that they left, but a sort of distorted mirror image of it, and the trade that built it with the legacy of enslavement and the sugar trade and all of that stuff. And then on top of that, there's Hawthorne, that there's this legacy of like creating that American identity, looking back and saying, what is America's history? In Hawthorne's mind, it's got a lot of darkness in it, and it's got a lot of sort of horror that he sees just creeping right below the surface, like the Salem witch trials. And then it's got that legacy as a community service organization, that we're a museum, we do public tours, we interpret for people that history in all its different facets, and also provide social services. So there's like this 3-part legacy that this site has of the wealth, the literature, and then as a museum that really make it a unique site.
Yeah. Do you have any questions?
Not till after.
Okay. All right. And so last question, what message do you have for future generations?
Yeah, that's a good one. To preserve your history and to not let it slip away. I mean, if you think there were thousands of houses in the 1600s, and today we have maybe 450 across all of New England, out of, about 100,000 people lived in New England in year 1700. So you're talking about like a tiny, tiny percentage of houses that have survived. And then like in terms of documents and letters, and like if you've got any kind of like family heirlooms, or if you've got any kind of way to preserve old buildings, or not let them, not tear them down to be developed for new houses and things like that. They say the greenest building is a building that's already existing. That preservation is also conservation, but not letting the past get lost is a big responsibility, I think, that people have.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you.